Hello
Well,
there.
hello there, Ron.
If I see you on my computer screen, it has to be Monday.
I'm like a living calendar.
That's exactly right. How is the time change? How are you dealing with that?
You know what? I haven't had to worry about it too much because it's been my weekend, but tomorrow morning I've got to be at work bright and early, and it's going to feel all the earlier. So, not my favorite thing. Daylight savings time never been my favorite thing, at least not the spring version. I like fall when we get an extra hour.
I agree with you, my friend. Yeah, I woke up today and thought, I can't do this. I
Hey,
cannot do this.
Ron,
Takes me
Pepper, nice to see you guys. Mary Beth, everybody jumping in tonight. Wonderful.
absolutely. Oh, Mary Beth is
Yeah.
having a bit of a migraine, but we'll make you feel better, I promise. And as all these people are coming in to listen, we're so happy to have you here. But if you can think of ideas for future shows, Chris and I were talking about this. We really like to get some input from our listeners here. So if there's something out there that you would be interested in hearing or tuning in for, let us know.
Absolutely. We're always open to it. And in fact, we love to hear ideas from you guys. So, there's a lot of monsters, mysteries, and myths out there. We're always willing to. And we've actually had some great shows based on things that you nice folks have suggested. So tonight is kind of a special night. It's a little bit of a delay because we had our technical glitch a couple weeks ago. But tonight is our sort of anniversary show. We actually premiered just a little bit over 1 year ago with a show that was very, very special to both Ron and I on the subject of werewolves. And of course, werewolves, huge thing for me. Ron, I know that you've written books on dogmen and everything, and so we're going to revisit that topic tonight, but with a special new angle. So we're going to go over if you've been with us for an entire year and you've seen the original show, or if you've gone back and watched it, you'll see a few familiar things, but then we're going to jump off into some new territory. So I'm looking forward to it.
I am too, and I wish we'd have had some champagne to crack open.
You know what? I'm working on a polar orange, so that's close enough for me. So,
yes, fantastic. But yeah, a year already. I cannot believe it. And one of our favorite subjects. There's no better way to start off the second year of our anniversary than having a show about werewolves.
I wish kind of we could have done it last week. We had a nice big full moon up in the sky as well, but I think you guys will all forgive us for that. So and yes, thanks for the congratulations, Sarah. We cannot believe that we've been on for an entire year doing this. Now, obviously, we don't have 52 episodes because we've taken a couple of hiatuses here and there, and we'll take another summer hiatus this year. But even still, we've got a lot of content, and we're looking forward to doing a lot more. So. All right. So you know what? I'm just going to jump right into it and start us off. And I want to we're going to do a little intro and then we're going to do a flashback here. So a little intro to the topic at hand. And it's a story that I've been fascinated with for many, many years. Because back in 1691, an elderly Livonian farmer, Livonia, by the way, is an area that is today, it's modern day Estonia and Latvia together created the Kingdom of Livonia. But an elderly farmer by the name of Thijs or Thijs, I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. I've always called him Thijs, but he was brought before the village magistrates to answer on charges of being a werewolf. Now, to the shock of everyone present, because this is a period in time when witch trials and things were going on, and it was not uncommon for people to be executed for this kind of thing, to the shock of everyone, Thijs readily admitted to being a werewolf, to taking the shape of a wolf, but he went on to describe his nocturnal activities in great detail. Now, people were very shocked because usually it required torture or some threats to get that kind of admission, but Thijs did not seem in the least ashamed of his nocturnal activities. In fact, he said that he was not a servant of the devil, as the magistrates tried to suggest, but rather a hound of God. He claimed that he was actually working for the forces of goodness and that he was the hound of God and one of many. And this, as you can imagine, was a great shock to the inquisitors and the people who were interviewing him. And this would go on to become one of the strangest cases in all of werewolf folklore. But before we get too deep into it, we do need to wind the clock back a little bit. So to understand the story of Thijs, we're going to go back and we're going to wind the centuries back a little bit and look at the beginning of the heresy trials and how these came to be a part of our history, one that I think most of us are familiar with.
Yeah, as I've studied this case in depth, and I think that we have to have some sort of background information, because if I were a defense attorney at this time, I think I would probably have Thijs to go this particular way as well too. But let's cover our background, and then we'll talk a little bit about that decision to claim that he was a werewolf.
Indeed. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the fact that there was a pretty long chunk of chunk of time in European history when what we tend to think of as the witch hunts were taking place. But the witch hunts really didn't start out specifically about witches. They started out about heresy. So several centuries between the late medieval period around the 12 or 1300s and all the way up into the 1700s, heresy trials were conducted by the Christian church all throughout Europe. People often talk about the Spanish Inquisition, which was obviously took place throughout Spain and Portugal, but there were inquisitions in France, in England, in Germany, and all across, hunting for people who were heretics. But in the process of hunting these heretics, people who were going against the ways of the church, it kind of became by default witch trials, and the fear of witchcraft began to grow and manifest at a time when people really started to think of witches as leftovers from fairy tales, and all of a sudden witches came sort of screaming back into the public consciousness as if they were something very real. And that's what the church wanted. The church wanted to convince people that they were very real. Now, the stated aim of these inquisitions, as I say, was to root out heretical beliefs, but the fear of witchcraft and devil worship was something that the church was able to use kind of as a tool. It was a great way to keep people in line. And so the burning times or the witch hunts became sort of the standard way that we remember this era in time. In fact, there's a lot of modern neo-pagans. I actually think we usually have a couple of pagans or Wiccans that follow the show. We often refer to this as the burning times, but a lot more than simply witches. There were Jews, homosexuals, people believed that there were werewolves. A lot of different people who were considered to go against the ways of the church were hunted and killed during this time.
Yeah, not the Catholic Church's greatest moments. This isn't on their top 10
No.
greatest hits album at all. But no, it was a terrible time, and it was a time whenever religion was in a flux, and politics and just life in general was changing. So when we think about an early modern world, which is essentially the Renaissance is, we see this throwback to what we thought should have been eliminated, hundreds of years ago, still popping up. And like you had said, this isn't ancient history. We can find in the 1700s, I think it was 1725, that the last witch was burned in Scotland. I mean, and we are talking about this is just a few decades before the French and Indian War with George Washington fighting. So this is essentially the very brink of a very modern world, and we're still hunting down people, accusing them of witchcraft at this time. But if we think about it, if we had the same type of worldview during this satanic panic in the 1980s, whenever people were looking at rock stars, this could have easily have happened. This was just a couple hundred years ago.
No, in fact, you mentioned the Satanic Panic. Right now, there's a brand new movie coming out in just a couple of weeks based on Dungeons and Dragons, which was a huge part of the Satanic Panic back in the 1980s. And to this day, there are people who believe that just playing this game, a simple fantasy game of imagination, actually conjures occult power and is an introduction into witchcraft. Back, I remember in the 80s and 90s, I don't know if any of you remember these little comic books called Chick Tracts that were sort of religious propaganda, and there was one that was called Dark Dungeons, and literally told a cartoon story about how playing Dungeons and Dragons was intense occult training to train people to be satanic witches. So I'm not sure if we've really come as far as we'd like to believe that we have.
Exactly, that's the absolute case.
So people were pretty fanatical back then, and as the church grew in power, certainly the fear of witchcraft was something that the church was heavy into the promotion of. And a couple of Catholic monks created a sort of a book to guide people in the rooting out of witches, and it was called the Malleus Maleficarum, which literally meant the hammer of evil or the hammer of witches, written in the mid 15th century, purporting to detail the authentic practices of black magic and outlining brutal methods of torture to extract confessions from the accused. Now, this would become literally the standard document of the witch hunters. Now, when it was first published in the 15th century, it was surprisingly not tremendously popular or tremendously widely used. And it fell out of favor for a century or two. But in the 16 and into the 1700s, when the witch trials started to pick up fervor again, people started again to return to the Malleus Maleficarum and used it as this guidebook in order to persecute what they at this point believed was an infestation of witches.
Yeah. It's kind of odd if you think about it, because at the time whenever book burning was taking place, and again, the analogy now that history doesn't exist in a vacuum, that we could turn towards a book like this to actually hunt down witches. It was based upon a couple people's opinions.
Right, and they came up with fanciful ideas. Obviously, not being witches themselves, they imagined all these different satanic practices, all the different ways that a witch's Sabbath would take place. They imagined the kind of the pacts and oaths that these witches would have to perform in order to pledge themselves to the devil. But it was all fanciful. It was basically it was fan service, or a sort of a fan fiction based on what they felt was the practice of witches. And interestingly enough, much of what they suggested was very sexual. They often suggested that these witches had to copulate with the devil or copulate with goats and things like that. And they were very focused on sort of sexual activity. And a lot of people look at it today and they realize that there was maybe not a lot of mental health, mental stability going on in the minds of these sort of Christian theologians who are creating this manual. Not to mention the fact that they, as Christians purporting to be people who were very loving, were suggesting truly brutal torture of these people suspected of being witches, often on the flimsiest of evidence, things like having a mark on your body, like a wart or something like that, that didn't appear to feel pain, and they called it a witch's teat. And so there were specific instructions for how to extract confessions for abnormalities on the body you could look for, and all of this was considered evidence that you had sold your soul to Satan.
That's right. There's a great movie out, and I believe it's Portuguese. It's about 3 or 4 years old. It's called A Coven of Sisters, and it's based upon these young girls being rounded up during the Inquisition in Portugal. A fantastic movie. It's only about an hour and a half long, so you're not going to spend your entire day. So as soon as this show's over, hop on over to Netflix.
Very good. So now, the focus of our episode being primarily on werewolves, we wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork here, and we're still going to continue on a little bit about the heresy trials themselves. But you'll notice that in none of what we've talked about in the last couple of minutes have we mentioned werewolves specifically, and that's because even the Malleus Maleficarum had almost no mention of shape-shifting or lycanthropy. There is one story in the Malleus Maleficarum that is sort of peripherally a werewolf story, in which a man who's besieged by devils is convinced that he is going out by night and he is murdering people in the shape of a wolf. But in the story, it turns out that this was a deceit by the devil. The devil wanted to torment this man, and so the devil would implant the memories of a real wolf who was actually going out and committing these crimes into this man just to torment him. So it has echoes of werewolf belief in it, but even still, not really the kind of werewolves we understood. But the Malleus Maleficarum may not have gone into detail about werewolves, but that didn't mean that they didn't end up becoming a target for some of these witch hunts. In fact, the Malleus Maleficarum itself not covering werewolves, and instead a judge and witch finder by the name of Henry Bouguer in 1610 wrote a study called A Discourse on the Evils of Sorcery. That's actually the revised edition. His original edition was simply called A Discourse on Sorcery, but I guess he wanted to make it a little bit more sexy sounding, so he updated it and made it The Discourse on the Evils of Sorcery.
He was originally going to name it 50 Shades of Discourse on the Evils of Sorcery.
And he would amend the oversight of the Malleus Maleficarum and go into great detail about lycanthropy, which he had direct experience with. In fact, he was the judge involved in some of the trials that we'll discuss later, in which people accused of lycanthropy or werewolfery were involved. But the thing about Bouguer is that he would go on to charge and execute countless men and women on grounds of lycanthropy, inciting fear and panic among the populace, who were led to believe that shape-shifting devourers of men literally lurked behind every tree and within every shadow. And it wasn't terribly difficult to convince people of this, because now we're talking about the 1600s, the 1700s, in places like rural France, rural Germany, where poverty, lack of food, plus clear cutting of trees, which had been very common at this time, led to wolves themselves becoming much more aggressive, and starvation, bringing wolves out of the forest to attack people. So because wolf attacks had become comparatively common, it was very easy to lead people to believe that this was actually the devil's, minions besieging mankind, and that in many cases that these were witches in the form of animals coming to torment people.
It's the fear of the unknown. I mean, the same thing happened in Salem as well. You're living on the frontier of a new world that you don't understand. There's animals out there, and there's also the Native Americans. So all of these things are perfect vehicles to say that the devil is in your midst.
It is, and the thing is that there's nothing that helps control a population better than fear. This is a time when the church was growing in power, and they needed to consolidate that power somehow. And by creating fear, especially fear of the unseen forces, fear of the things we've talked about, the idea of the invisible world before on the show, the idea that these demonic forces that exist outside of ordinary people's perception, and that if only the church has the power to protect you from them. That not only do you need to pray, but you can't just simply pray and stay at home, that you need to go to church. You need to tithe to the church, and you need to basically, prop up your local church and your local, clergy. And in doing so, they will protect you from the evils at large. And so it was a very effective way to sort of solidify your grasp on the population, which is why stories of witches, devils, werewolves, and things like that were not only, commonplace, but very, very easy to convince a superstitious populace.
Yeah, call me old-fashioned, but I'd much rather have that kind of fear implanted in me than the weather balloon theories. I would much rather this happening than shooting down weather balloons.
Well, it is funny that immediately, as soon as the weather balloon, and the other objects that were shot down in the sort of intervening days, people began to say, what if these were UFOs? What if these were ETs? And I have to say that I understand why a person would jump to that conclusion very quickly, but you have to imagine, after all this time, if in fact any extraterrestrial, visitors were coming here, that their technology would be advanced enough that I don't think that they would simply show up in our atmosphere and be easily shot down by an ordinary, by the technology that we have today. So that seemed like a very doubtful idea to me. But nonetheless, people quickly jumped to these conclusions.
Same thing that happened, though. That's what I said. Even though we are an educated group of people now, and we're all linked together with the internet and television and CNN and Fox News and all that stuff, we are still the same, aren't we? We are willing to believe whatever we are told, and then we follow like sheep, and then people get killed.
All right. Well, hey, I'm John from Manchester, England. I'm glad to have you aboard there. John Bill Clinton Smith. That's quite a name you got there. So welcome aboard. What time is it over in Manchester right now? It's got to be the wee hours of the morning. So glad to have you aboard and watching with us tonight. So yes, we are as superstitious and as quick to believe things as we have ever been, and certainly maybe not a whole lot more credulous than we were, or less credulous than we were in the Middle Ages. But the truth is that we do want to believe in things. We desperately want to believe in the supernatural, in things that exist on the other side, because that's the great mystery of life. And so we're hungry for those things, and sometimes that makes it a little bit easy to lead us by the nose, and even sometimes into things that aren't necessarily logical and aren't necessarily in our best interest. Past 1 p.m. Oh my goodness! Well, so I
think he misspelled. I think he was going 1 a.m. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So in any case. So I've mentioned a word a couple of times here, and we talked about it in our original episode, which is the word lycanthropy. And this is what people were referring to it at the time. Lycanthropy comes from the Greek words lukos, meaning wolf, and anthropos, meaning man. So when you hear the word lycanthropy, it literally means wolf man. And it is a common assertion that the word lycanthropy was actually comes from the Greek myth of the king Lycaon. Now, Lycaon was a king of Arcadia, thousands of years ago, and he was a very, very he was an arrogant king. He was very full of himself and not particularly virtuous man. Well, because he was a powerful king, Zeus actually deigned to come and dine with the king of Arcadia. And when Zeus arrived for this banquet, along with a few other deities, the king decided to test his divinity. And to test his divinity, he had one of his own children killed, diced up, and made into a meal to serve the king, because he knew that if Zeus was truly a god, that he would be able to detect the human flesh. Well, unfortunately, Lycaon got more than he bargained for. Not only did Zeus immediately realize that it was in fact a human flesh, but he cursed Lycaon for his barbarous and beastly act and caused Lycaon to become a wolf. By the way, spoiler alert: he also restored Lycaon's son to life. So the murdered child was restored to life, but as a punishment, Lycaon became a wolf, and turning into a wolf, ran off into the woods, and his name, Lycaon, allegedly gave us the word lycanthropy. But the honest truth of it is that this is probably a reversal of the way things happened. Lycaon's name most likely actually comes from the word leukos for wolf. Therefore, the myth evolved from the word, not the other way around. And this is probably because there was a wolf cult that actually operated in the Arcadian forest. In the mountains of Arcadia, there were a cult that would come together every year to worship Zeus Lycaeus. Now, an interesting thing about Zeus, we tend to think of Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, as the same way when in the Christian world we refer to God as though God is the name of the being. But God isn't the name of the being. God is simply the description. So God is a deity, the God of the Christians, they're called by many names, Yahweh, etc. But Zeus is the same. Zeus literally just means Deus. It means God. And so Zeus wasn't just a single being. Zeus often referred to either the great god, Zeus, the one, or it referred to the little subversions, these sort of regional variations. And one of these was Zeus Lycaeus, which was wolfish Zeus. And this cult would get together every year, and they would honor Zeus Lycaeus with a ritual in which they were supposed to have sacrificed a person and consumed that person's flesh. But one of the congregation, every year when they met together, one of the congregation would actually incur the power of the god and become a wolf for 7 years, run off into the woods, and then 7 years later be able to retain its human form. But it's from that old cult and the myth connected to it that we get the legend of the king Lycaon, who actually gives us the name lycanthropy. So it's a little bit of a convoluted story, but this is why werewolves to this day are referred to as lycans or lycaon, lycanthropes, meaning, again, wolf and man, the combination of wolf and man.
And just to show how long that history goes back, which is fascinating. Now, one of the Greek travel writers, and of course they did have travel writers back there, his name was Pausanias, and he wrote a story about this particular little place in Arcadia, and he claims that an Olympic athlete, so he was naming names here. It was like if he would have said like Greg Louganis went out there, but he claims that an Olympic athlete actually turned into a werewolf during one of these ceremonies and remained in that state for the 7 years and 1 day or whatever the period was. So this was kind of front page headlines right then. This was this was like if it appeared in a AAA type of manual. This was what was going on out there, and if you were in that particular neck of the woods, and this was a pretty backwater neck of the woods in Greek speaking, anyways.
It was indeed.
But yeah, so I mean, this would be the place that you could go and watch all these rites, but yeah, this was a time of sacrificing of dogs and all these other kind of elaborate sacrifices, going back, like you said, to show in even further back in antiquity exactly what kind of gods were being worshipped. And somebody on here said about the idea of the animalistic side and the human side coming together in a lot of these tales. I really think that's what was going on as well too. This was a time of the year whenever you could honor the bestial side of yourself, but also take into account that we are humans as well. So we have control over these events as long as we don't allow these events to take control over us. Kind of like with Dionysus and drinking and things like that. On those kind of same levels, you cannot allow yourself to become that which you fear.
And that's actually, honestly, one of the big cautionary tales that you see in Greek and Roman myths. Is you often have these deities and people who sort of share these sort of dual natures between animal and beast. But when the beast takes over, the tales always end up becoming tragedies. And the Greeks were obsessed with werewolves, by the way. There are werewolf stories in many different aspects of Greek mythology and in Greek literature. I believe it was Petronius who wrote the Satyricon. There's a brief werewolf story in there as well. And in this story, a traveling man decides to he leaves a banquet and he wants to go and visit, I believe it was a potential suitor who lives a few miles away. And a soldier who happens to be at the same banquet as he is says, you know what, I'll go for a walk with you. So the two of them end up on the road, and as they are walking to this woman's house a few miles away, the soldier gazes up in the sky, the clouds part, and as the moon comes up, the soldier suddenly stops dead where he is in the middle of the road, and the other gentleman doesn't know why he's doing this, but he drops all of his clothes, he pees in a circle around his clothes, at which time they turn to stone, and then he literally sheds his human form, becomes a wolf, and runs off in search of prey. The gentleman obviously is terrified. He runs as fast as he can, gets to the house of the woman that he's wooing, and she says, "Oh, I wish you'd come just a few moments sooner. A tremendous wolf leapt through the window and savaged one of my servants, and we don't even think he's going to live." And of course, at this point now, the man realizes that the soldier ran ahead of him, basically used him as a patsy, ran ahead of him, and ended up sating his thirst on one of the servants of this woman. So it's just it's a short werewolf story. It doesn't even really have a moral to the tale, but it's the kind of little short adventure story that the Greeks loved. And again, werewolves turn up in their own way in many different aspects of that mythology, as do these other different beast men like Dionysus and Bacchus, both who are sort of these goat and kind of combination of a goat and a human. And you've got the fauns and the satyrs from Greek mythology as well. They had a very strong sense of that balance of animal and man, and of the ways in which that balance could be upended.
Yes, because even in the cult of Dionysus, a person could be consumed if you allow that to take over, that enthusiasm to take over, the idea that you're possessed by the god. But I think one of the reasons why we are so attracted to the wolf is because it's a lot like us, right? They have societies, they have communications, they have a hierarchy. So a lot of the times we do see ourselves, or at least we project a lot of ourselves onto the wolf, because they've always been in our periphery ever since we were here on Earth, and probably one of our first pets was the dog and all that kind of stuff. But the wolf, we've always had this kind of strange relationship with them, because we would take them in as pets, and we would be able to eventually get them down to where we have our pet dogs. But they would also prey upon us as well, too. So an uneasy alliance.
It is. But it's interesting, too, and it's a really important point to note, is that the idea of the animal aspect of our nature being a negative thing or being a savage thing is not, I wouldn't say recent. Certainly it goes back a few thousand years, but in the earliest human religion, this is something we talked about quite a bit in our original episode on werewolves, because we went right back into prehistory to discuss the origin of the werewolf myth. But there was a time when the idea of a human being adopting an animal spirit or animal aspect was considered to be sacred. In fact, the idea is that the belief that some people had the ability to become wild animals is universal. First of all, it does literally happen all over the world in every single different culture. There's nowhere on Earth that you don't have some version of a human being becoming or taking on the aspects of an animal. But this was considered to be a sacred practice in the earliest human culture. Back before we had cities, back before religion became organized, shamanic belief in the idea of animals as being sacred beings, and sometimes being even spiritual entities unto themselves, was very common. And someone that had the ability to take on that aspect was considered to be a holy person, a shaman. So for tens of thousands of years, magic was a part of daily human life. And that ability to take on the shape of an animal was seen as one of the most powerful of all gifts.
Yeah, these are great points. And this is what I'm so fascinated about, going back to as early as we can, like archaeologists, and try to dig up what's going on. But yeah, when we think of the vision quest and the spirit quest and First Nations people, Native Americans go through, we're looking into that same element that everybody around the world at some point in their evolutionary upbringing, as cultures started to evolve, all went through this particular phase.
And the truth is that whether we realize it or not, we haven't really left it behind. It's
Right.
simply changed shape, ironically enough, because, and this is something that I love to point out whenever I discuss the magic and the history of shapeshifting, is that look at how we still revere the power of animals today and attempt to take it on. What's one of the most, fastest, most sought after cars in the world? A Jaguar.
Mhm.
What is you've got every sports team out there, or virtually every sports team is named after an animal. You've got the Sharks, you've got the Dolphins, you've got you've got the Rams, saber tooth, things like that. All of these mystical ideas of animals, we put those jerseys on when we play sports to take on the power that is associated with the colors of your, the colors of your favorite team. Maybe you go to a sports game, you're going to paint your face in the colors of them, and you're going to wear that jersey because you want to take on that power and you want to be able to give it back. And what is that if not magic? And the fact that so frequently we associate these ideas with specific animals. And let's face it, you're never going to find a sports team, that's going to call itself the Michigan, bunny rabbits, or the Idaho mice, because those animals are not considered powerful. They're not the sort of thing that we want to take on the aspects of. So you're going to talk about predatory animals. You're going to talk about powerful animals, Kodiaks, bears, wolves, jaguars, tigers, these powerful animals that we want to make us feel powerful and make us feel strong and fast. And that's something that is as shamanic today as it was 60,000 years ago, when the very first people were painting cave images of bison, of bison that were walking on their hind legs in order to get good luck in the hunt.
Absolutely. Now, I will tell you, the Carolina Mudcats, as their mascot is the catfish, but of course that's a minor league team. But we also have these, and I know this is a little bit off track, but we have the idea of furries as well too, right? I mean, we have the idea of people physically becoming something they admire and something they want to be. So all of this stuff has it completely separated from who we are as humans. It's still there.
No, in fact, the furries are, in a way, representative of the broader practice of cosplay, which has become, so popular, especially in the last couple of decades. Cosplay, literally just meaning costume play, is sort of an, a contraction of that. But the idea that taking on the character of your favorite, superhero, of your favorite, movie characters and things like that, and it's because we find power, we take power, we take, sort of strength and energy from these beings. Now, we don't think of these things in a shamanic or magical way when we do them, any more than your average person in Wisconsin puts a piece of cheese on their head and thinks that they're taking on the power of cheese. It's obviously a little bit more complex, but also a little bit more innocent than that. But the basic concept of that sort of shamanic or imitative magic is there. Imitative magic, of course, we talked about this many months ago in one of our early ideas, that magic in folklore falls into two basic categories. You have imitative magic and you have sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is carrying a lucky rabbit's foot, because you believe that the foot itself of the rabbit is the thing that carries the energy of the spirit, and by having a part of that, wearing a bear claw around your neck or feathers in your hair, that you actually take the physical properties of that being and you actually can absorb them. But imitative magic is more dressing up in a costume, pretending to be a creature. And if you wanted to have the strength of a jaguar, you get down on all fours and you actually mimic the movements of a jaguar. If you want to have vision, you may spread your arms and flap around a fire in the guise of an eagle or a hawk. So you can imitate a creature that you want to become, or you can take on the aspect of it by wearing a wolf skin. For instance, the wolf skin combines both. You have both the imitation of the image, but you also have the energy of the creature itself from the skin. And so you combine both of those, it becomes a powerful form of magic. And our ancestors believed that this is how they could be successful at the hunt, how they could run faster, find prey more effectively. And for all we know, it may have been very effective, even if it was only psychosomatic.
Absolutely. So as we take the great tape recorder that is history and we fast forward it, now by the time we get to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we still see this happening, the idea of magic. But now the idea of Satan comes into play. And this is where the whole crux of the situation is. Magic in and of itself was not bad. The actual thing that will get you killed is the witchcraft part, because that is meaning that you're dealing with the devil in some way. There's some sort of pact in which you're able to perform these things, and that's what's going to be getting you killed. That's the reason, coming back to our buddy Theiss, which is why I think that he had such a great defense, because he was an elderly man, for one thing. He knew that his options were probably extremely limited. He also probably knew that there was a lot of people going to be accusing him. So I think that his defense was the best that he could possibly come up with.
It is, but it's interesting that and we're gonna go into it later, so I'm gonna table it for a moment. But the thing is that his defense may have actually saved his life ultimately.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely,
and the details, because we're gonna get back to that a little bit later. But the details of it are actually fascinating, and he pulled a whammy, for the ages on those inquisitors. But before we get there, I do want to point out that so we have this shamanic magic that for such a long time was a big part of who we were. But as civilization grew, as we began to coalesce into cities and religion became more organized and things like that, our perspectives on magic changed. But werewolves and shapeshifting didn't automatically become evil. In fact, right into the Middle Ages, you still had examples of heroic werewolves appearing in stories. And specifically, the reason we focus on werewolves is not because they're not the only shapeshifter in human history or in human myth, obviously, but they're one of the most common. And I think it's because throughout most of the northern hemisphere of the planet, even to some degree in the southern hemisphere of the planet, they're one of the most common predators, one of the ones that we have throughout history revered the most. And so it's an incredibly common in Native American culture and Viking culture, throughout all of Europe, even into Asia. Wolves were a part of the presence, and so they have become kind of the icon among the shapeshifters. But medieval legends of heroic werewolves were not uncommon. There's the legend of William of Palerne, who was a prince who was escaped an assassination plot and was actually cared for and raised by a werewolf. There's a medieval romance called William and the Werewolf. But one of my favorite stories, it's a wonderful legend that comes from Brittany in the 1200s, is the lay, which means the song of Bisclavret. Now, this is a wonderful story, and in it, a knight and marries a beautiful young woman who he loves very deeply. But every week for 3 days, the knight disappears into the forest, and when he comes back after 3 days, his wife is always beside herself with worry, but he refuses to tell her where she goes. And after living with him for a while, she eventually says, if you truly love me, you'll tell me where you go for those 3 nights a week. And he says, I can't tell you. If I told you that, my life would be forfeit. And she says, well, then clearly you don't love me. You don't trust me. And she manages to convince him eventually to reveal his secret. So he tells her that he, in fact, for 3 nights every week, becomes a wolf and runs free in the forest. And she's sort of puzzled and isn't sure she believes him, but eventually says, so you go running as a wolf in the forest wearing your clothing? And he says, no, I have to take off my clothing and I have to hide them somewhere, because if I didn't get back to my clothing, I couldn't ever regain my human form. And she said, well, where do you hide your clothing? And he says, okay, that's a step too far. I cannot tell you that. If I ever lost my clothing, I'd be trapped as a wolf forever. And she says, well, then clearly you don't love me because you don't trust me. And again, she twists his arm. She basically manipulates him and gets him to tell her where he keeps his clothing. Well, the faithless wife realizes that she cannot stomach the idea of sleeping beside a werewolf every night. So she betrays him, and she gets another knight who had always wanted to be with her to steal her husband's clothing and trap him in the form of a wolf. So he goes ravaging through the forest, can't find his clothes, and is forced to stay in the shape of a wolf. But one day the king, who the knight had been a great advisor to. So one day the king is out hunting and he sees this enormous wolf running through the woods, and he and his men chase the wolf down. And when they finally surround the wolf, they run it to exhaustion, surround it, and they're about to slay it. But the wolf dives between the legs of the knights and comes right to the foot of the king's horse and bows down before the king. And the king immediately stops his men from slaying this wolf. He says that, see, this dumb creature recognizes my divinity, recognizes that I am the king. What an extraordinary creature! And he orders his men to allow the wolf to follow him home, which it follows him home, and it becomes his boon companion. And it's gentle, it's docile, and it clearly deeply loves the king. Time goes by, and the king holds a great feast, a great banquet in his hall. And two of the guests are the faithless wife who had once betrayed the knight, and the new knight who had taken over the werewolf's land. Well, as soon as this wonderful, docile wolf, who's lived with the king for many, many years now, sees the faithless wife, he leaps upon her and he claws her, bites the nose right off of her face. And the king immediately realizes that something is terribly wrong, and he knows that this is the wife of the knight, this faithful knight of his who disappeared all so long ago. And so they torture the woman and they get the confession out of her, and she finally admits the truth. The clothing is restored to the knight. He takes his human form again, but still, for 3 nights every night, he becomes a werewolf, just as he always had. The king forgives him for his sort of strange behavior, and he becomes a great companion and a faithful bodyguard for the king for the rest of his days. So it's a wonderful myth. And it's a legend that sort of belies the idea of the evil werewolf completely. Here we have the werewolf is not only the victim of the story, but ultimately completely heroic. And even when the werewolf behaves savagely, it's considered to be a justified revenge against the woman who did him harm, and becomes the companion to the king. And so this was not a foregone conclusion at this time that werewolves were evil. It actually took some time before the evil aspect of the werewolf was sort of baked itself into history. And this, unfortunately, again, was because the way the church needed to coalesce its power, and the idea that magic, even magic of the most innocuous kind in the hands of the people, was considered to be a challenge to God. And so they began to suggest the idea that all magic came from evil. So as civilization again grew more dominant, magical beliefs put people at odds with the church, and the practice of sorcery ended up becoming the crime which they referred to as heresy, even though in those earliest days, even that was not considered to be, it wasn't a death-worthy crime. Heresy was considered to be something that you might be, you might have a spell in the stocks, or you might be whipped or flogged. But it took a while before it became a killing offense, and this is because, again, apparently the milder the punishment, the less likely it was to deter people from practicing these old magical ways.
Right. Yeah, and the thing is, this is not just like a death sentence. Whenever they would execute somebody, this was a permanent excommunication. This was done in a way so you have no chance for redemption. This is the world. This is the church taking on itself, being the figure of Christ, and saying there's not a chance you're ever going to have any kind of redemption. And that's also the sad part about this as well, too, because we see a religionist. One of our listeners talked about this about 30 minutes ago. We have a religion that talks about forgiving others, and now we see a religion that has now become monolithic, and it is now taking all those words and using against the very people that it's trying to serve.
Absolutely. So as the church, grows in power, it demonizes, it vilifies all forms of magic, and this makes very easy to sort of get the people on your side to stamp out witchery. Because while once upon a time people would have gone to a village witch or a village wise woman for herbs and simples in order to cure simple ailments, or for a charm to keep the crops growing, now they were convinced by the church that these were the powers of the devil at work. It's true that maybe your crops would be better that year, but this was the devil's deceit. And in truth, you were, at the cost of good crops was the loss of your own soul. And so it was fairly easy to turn people against these witches. And witchcraft, the practice of magic, had begun to become the woman's curse, because I think as the church grew and of course became very, very male dominated, and this was something that really from the very beginning, the vilification of women became a big part of this. And we all know that during most of the witchcraft trials, the vast majority of the people were executed were women. But men were not exempt from the idea of of magical transgression. Now, some men who were considered to be werewolves or lycanthropes, who were considered to be cursed in this way, were thought to have been cursed by a witch and therefore were at least peripherally innocent. However, some of them went out of their way and and actually made a pact with the devil themselves in order to get the same kind of power that the women had. Women were thought to be shapeshifters who could become a cat or a hare or a bird in order to uncover secrets. But men were considered to be more violent, and so they were seen as wolves or bears or other savage creatures. And it was believed that they too had the ability to make pacts with Satan. And so werewolves became a sort of a secondary pursuit, largely, as I say, at the at the urging of Henri Bouguet, who believed that werewolves were just as vile and just as common as witches, but it never really got to the degree that you had with the witch trials, and so a lot fewer people were accused of werewolfery or lycanthropy, as it were. But a lot fewer really doesn't mean that much when you're dealing with literally tens of thousands of people who were accused, and many of these people being executed. Not everyone accused of witchcraft or sorcery was executed, but a lot of them were. And among the men, the vast majority of them ended up being accused of one of two things: either being a warlock, which we tend to think that warlock means male witch, but it actually is an old Scottish term that means oath breaker. And it was believed that a man who trafficked in magic or trafficked with witches had broken his sacred oath to God. And so it came to become a word that defined male witchery, although that's not really what it means. But the second one was the practice of lycanthropy, the idea of selling your soul to the devil for the ability to become a wolf or a savage creature.
And we can see that as well, too. There's a lot of different references in history where you make a deal with the devil, usually out in the forest someplace, and he gives you a salve to rub on your body or a belt made out of a wolf skin to tie around your waist to allow that transformation to take place.
And that took place in almost all of the stories that in some form or another, which is interesting because we see in these old stories that they don't really match the werewolf folklore that we're accustomed to today. Today, when we think of werewolves, we think of things like full moons and silver bullets, and being bitten by a werewolf turns you into a werewolf. But most of that was not a part of old werewolf folklore. Silver has some presence in old werewolf folklore, but for the most part, you had to become a werewolf by magic or by a curse of some kind. Now, one of the earliest of these werewolves, and this is when the fear really began to take off. One of the earliest of these werewolves was a man by the name of Michael Verdun. Now, he was supposedly the leader of a pack known as the Werewolves of Poligny. I'm probably not pronouncing that correct. I apologize. I don't speak much French. But the Werewolves of Poligny allegedly were given belts of wolf skin, just as you were saying, by the devil in 1521, which allowed them to change shape. When Verdun was captured after a wolf was wounded, the huntsmen followed the trail of blood back to a cottage in the woods. And when they entered the cottage, they found Verdun nursing a wound in exactly the place where the wolf had been wounded, and assumed immediately that this was proof that he was the werewolf. So they brought him in. I can imagine that they tortured him heinously, and under torture, he identified several other members of the community who he had also run in a pack with, and these became the Werewolves of Poligny. And this is one of those early werewolf trials that sort of laid that groundwork, kind of spread the seed of fear that werewolves were out there in the forest, lurking and waiting to pounce upon you. And probably the kind of thing that inspired people like Charles Perrault, who wrote Little Red Cap or Little Red Hood, the story that would go on to become Little Red Riding Hood. The idea that a wolf walking on two legs wearing human clothes in the forest might pounce upon you and devour you if you stop to speak to him.
That's right. That's right. Also, to think about, 1521 or whatever that story took place. Again, not that old. St. Augustine was founded in 1513.
Right.
So we already have people established in Florida, and there's people out there still hunting werewolves.
And I mean, it's hard to imagine in an era when we think of, the advancement of science beginning. I mean, certainly it wasn't exactly, we weren't exactly a scientific community at that point. We had still yet to, to put Galileo on trial for daring to believe that he was smarter than theologians. But even still, we were an intelligent species. We had wonderful inventions that we'd created. I believe that firearms already existed at that point. I mean, we were an inventive, creative species, and yet still so easily convinced that the dark forces of Satan lurked around every corner, and that anyone who didn't fit our idea of what an upstanding citizen could be might be in league with the devil.
Right. And the printing press has been out since 1450. And as you said, earlier, one of the first things that was being mass produced was these books, not only the Malleus Maleficarium, but there were other books being reproduced on how to root witches out of society.
And interestingly enough, of course, your average peasant at that time, not very likely to be able to read, but they could certainly listen to the pulpits, the sermon from the pulpit in any of their local churches. And as the priests, who almost all were able to read these salacious tales of witches, werewolves, and sort of demonic manifestation, they would spread that through the pulpit. And so the people would be able to share those stories, because storytelling was one of the most important ways that these legends spread. So Gilles Garnier, another one of these werewolves, this was in 1573. He was a recluse living in the northeastern France, and he's often referred to as the Werewolf of Dole. And like so many others, he confessed to having killed and eaten half a dozen young children in the shape of a wolf after being given a magical salve by a strange spirit in the woods. But the thing about Garnier, and probably about Michael Verdun as well, is that these were not wealthy people. These were not people with much power, and they were, realistically speaking, easy scapegoats. Now, is it possible that these men were truly out there murdering people? Of course it is. There were killers, there were murderers back then, and that is entirely possible. In fact, some people when they historically refer to these figures, often call them serial killers, assuming that they must be guilty. But it's also perfectly possible that they were an easy scapegoat for real wolf killings, or, I mean, for all we know, actual werewolves. But we're going to table that one, because that one certainly remains very much in the theoretical. But it was, as I say, primarily men, not all, but primarily men who were accused of being werewolves. But it wasn't, as I say, all. One of the most notorious was another woman by the name of Pernette Gandillon. She was actually the sort of the progenitor of the Gandillon clan. Around 1598, in a rare instance of a woman being accused of lycanthropy, Pernette Gandillon was killed by the villagers of St. Claude after attacking and devouring a child, which they claimed to have witnessed. However, after Pernette was killed, they descended upon her home and found that her brother Pierre, his son Georges, and his daughter Antoinette all agreed, or rather confessed to being in league with the devil. The men, both Pierre and Georges, agreed that they had become werewolves, and Antoinette was accused of witchcraft. So not of being a werewolf, interestingly enough, despite the fact that her mother, or rather her aunt, had been. However, all three of them were burned at the stake. And this is, again, one of the only werewolf families out there that appears to have had equal opportunity for both sexes.
That's right. And again, to put things in perspective, this happened in France. If you would have crossed the channel, you would have been able to go watch the premiere of Romeo and Juliet in England at this time.
Exactly. It's strange. I've often thought it's odd that the Shakespeare wrote about all sorts of magical topics, but never included a werewolf. He even had shapeshifting, like Bottom, who was turned into half of an ass, but never actually wrote about werewolves in his stories, despite all of his other magical creatures.
Yeah, maybe there's a lost play out there someplace.
So one of the more tragic figures, I think, from this era of werewolf trials was a young boy by the name of Jean Grenier. Now, in 1603, Jean Grenier was just 13 years old, and he claimed that a dark-skinned man calling himself the Lord of the Forest had given him a wolf skin to wear, which turned him into a beast which hungered for human flesh. He confessed to having killed several small children, but he was actually caught because he approached a couple of girls his own age, began to flirt with them, and when they didn't respond to his advances, he claimed that they should be nice to him because he would otherwise turn into a wolf and devour them. They reported him to the town magistrates, and when he was rounded up, he didn't hesitate. They didn't need to torture him. He readily admitted to being a werewolf. He ran around on all fours, and indeed claimed that he had killed and eaten children. But despite his claims, he was actually allowed to live out the rest of his days in a monastery. Apparently, they believed that he was so overwhelmed by the forces of the devil that he wasn't in control of his own body, and so he lived for about another decade in the care of a monastery. Always remained completely feral and never regained his sort of human sensibility. But interesting thing about the story of Jean Grenier, unlike some of the other werewolf stories that we've told, which have been passed down through legend but do have some presumed basis in historic fact, the story of Jean Grenier actually still exists in court records. So you can find the original court records and logs of Jean Grenier's court and everything that was determined about him. So I believe that the primary source is actually held in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, France, but another later edition, handwritten still from the 17th century, actually exists in a university vault in Austin, Texas, of all strange places. Wow. And they had acquired it along with a lot of other folios and didn't even realize what they had. So several firsthand or at least original source copies exist of the record of the trial and the mysterious story of Jean Grenier.
Utterly fascinating.
So we've talked a lot about how these werewolf trials came to be, how we vilified the idea of shape-shifting into wolves, but we haven't gotten back to our original story, and that's what I'd like to come back to. So let's revisit for just a moment that original slide that I threw up there, and we talked about the fact that, remember, in 1691, this elderly Livonian farmer called Theiss was brought before the village magistrates to answer for charges of being a werewolf, and when confronted, he gladly, happily, almost proudly admitted that he was indeed, and he referred to himself as one of the Hounds of God. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was actually an area which today would be modern-day Estonia and Latvia. He was from a little town called Jürgensburg, which I don't believe technically exists anymore. Or actually, I'm sorry, he was from a town called Kaltebrunn, but was tried in Jürgensburg. But the reason he actually came to trial, and this is intriguing, is that he had actually been called as a witness in a thievery case that he was not involved in. He was simply called by a witness. And when he was brought, and as I say, this is a gentleman that was in his 80s, he was really quite frail. And for this time, we're talking about the early 1600s here, or the late 1600s rather, 80 was quite old. I mean, this is well beyond anybody's lifespan. So the fact that he was still even on his two legs was remarkable. However, he was called as a witness, and when he came to the stand, the accused thief said, "You can't believe anything he says. He's in league with the devil. The man is a werewolf." And the judges said, that's a pretty bizarre claim. What do you have to say to that, Mr. Theiss? And Theiss says, "Of course I'm a werewolf, but I'm not in league with the devil at all. I work for God. I am a hound of God, just like all my fellow werewolves were. I haven't been a werewolf in years. I'm too old for that, but I am a hound of God." They didn't know what to do with that. These are people who were used to either having to extract a confession by torture or any number of things. But here was a man who was literally claiming to be doing the work of God himself. In fact, what he claimed is that he and his fellow werewolves were warriors fighting against the devil, and that on the holy days every year, known as the Ember Days, they would descend to the underworld and battle demons and evil witches on behalf of God. The Inquisitors truly had no idea what to do with this. They pressed him. They said, "Okay, well, surely, the power of the werewolf, extends not from God, but rather from the devil himself. So just admit it. You've already said you're a werewolf. Just admit that you work for the devil." And he was very offended by this. And he said, "No, absolutely not. I am a holy man. I'm a good church-going man, and absolutely also a werewolf." And they just didn't know what to do. And so the bizarre part about this is that in the end, they could not sensibly execute a man who was claiming so fervently to be a servant of God. He seemed so sincere. It basically went against everything they were taught. And so as bizarre as it was, they had to punish him somehow because they felt that he was clearly, by being a werewolf, he was committing a kind of a crime, or at least going against what they considered to be being a good upstanding Christian man, but executing him was out of the question. And so they did the only thing that they could do. They actually ended up sentencing him to 20 public lashes and banishment. Well, that may not be the best thing that you can do for an 80-year-old man, but it was an awful lot better than being burned at the stake. And so in claiming to be a werewolf in the service of God, one of the hounds of God himself, he actually probably ended up saving his own life, which is really quite remarkable. And one of, I'd say, the strangest bits of werewolf folklore in all of history.
That's right. That's right. No, I always found it fascinating the first time I ever came upon this story, that he would use that, and they didn't just summarily kill him. That was the big thing. But I've said this before when we first touched upon this a year ago. There needs to be a movie made about this, and if
I wish someone would.
Yep, and if I ever get in the proper mind and start my own motorcycle gang, it will be called the Hounds of God.
Absolutely. Now, there is one interesting little side note to this, which is that there is actually some precedent for what Theis had to say about this Hounds of God. A wonderful anthropologist by the name of Carlo Ginzburg has written several books. One of the most notable is called Night Battles, and it talked about the culture of these sort of agrarian pagan traditions of traveling into the underworld for the sake of the community. Because just like in the Persephone myth, the idea is that the underworld sort of claims the sort of livelihood of the land, and that you have to go back and retrieve it in order for spring to happen. So it was almost this mythic idea. And in northern Italy, in an area called the Friuli, there's actually a tradition that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, probably more than that, of people called the Benandanti. And the Benandanti are people born between Christmas Eve and Twelfth Night, and supposedly born with the ability to change shape and travel to the underworld for exactly this purpose. In fact, Benandanti literally means the good travelers or the good walkers, and because they're the people who can walk between worlds for the good of the community. So they're these shamanic, shape-shifting figures from European history that almost perfectly mirror the claims that Theis made. And it really isn't the only place in Europe that these exist, but the Benandanti is one of the most unique examples of it. So perhaps he was part of some old pagan tradition and actually participated in these rituals. Who's to say? But again, still one of the most remarkable werewolves in all of history, and one of the last great heroic werewolves in medieval or sort of early modern history.
Yeah, at that age, he basically lived about 3 times the normal age of the age of expectation. So it's very possible within that time frame he either came upon one of these old ceremonies, or at least he heard about these ceremonies, or somebody had witnessed it themselves.
Well, he was pretty proud of his participation. So it seems he was pretty indignant when they suggested that he would work for the devil. So a funny story is that he actually told the magistrates that in fact just a few years prior he had broken his nose because he had gone down to hell in order to battle against the demons, and an evil witch from a rival village had struck him in the nose with a broomstick, and he had broken his nose that way. So his story was so detailed, as I say, they just had no idea what to make of him.
Yes. But did his wife believe him?
I don't know if she did. I'd say that at that point, at that point, I'm not sure that anyone was still alive. That he probably didn't have any relatives left at that point. So I do want to close with one other werewolf trial, which was quite remarkable because of its era. Theis was not the last werewolf trial out there. In fact, the last one happened in the 1800s. Remarkably, in fact, it's quite an extraordinary story. It was 1853. So I mean, this is Lord Byron and Mary Shelley. Frankenstein had already been published. This is a comparatively modern period in history. Queen Elizabeth, or rather Queen Victoria, was already in power in England. Yeah. And in Spain, a man by the name of Manuel Romasanta was, as I say, perhaps the last true werewolf trial, sentenced to death after confessing to the murders of more than a dozen people in Spain. It said that he actually, after killing his victims, that he would actually scrape the fat from inside their skin and use it to make soap. He was a traveling merchant and left a wake of corpses behind him. But while the court rejected his claim of being possessed by a wolf, he did indeed claim that a wolf possessed him and caused him to do his evil deeds. Queen Isabella II commuted his death death sentence to allow him to be studied as a rare case of clinical lycanthropy. And he would go on to live for about another decade before he allegedly died of some kind of a stomach ailment in prison. But probably the last werewolf trial. And the interesting thing about that is that that one has been made into a film. It's actually an excellent film. It's not the easiest to find. It's most commonly in the U.S. You might find it under Roma Santa, The Werewolf Hunt. And it's an excellent film. It stars very popular British actor Julian Sands, who unfortunately I believe we lost recently. But an unexpectedly good film, and it stays pretty true to the history of the real Manuel Roma Santa, but it does something which I appreciate as a lover of werewolf stories. It does explore the werewolf angle and the serial killer angle, and it tells the story in such a way that it allows you as the viewer to decide which of those you think is true. But it's a wonderful film if you can find it. Not so easy to find, but certainly worth tracking down.
Yeah, very cool. I did not even know that film existed. That's great.
It's really excellent. I was expecting it to be a cheesy horror film when I saw it in the video store. That's putting some age on me there back many years ago. But no, it really well done. Nice production values, great little historical sort of a mystery. So
yeah, and to put that in perspective, George Washington was dead for 54 years before that happened.
Exactly. So I mean, we're talking about, again, it's an era in history which we would really consider to be quite modern. So
well, absolutely.
Well, guys, thank you for sticking around a couple extra minutes here. We did run over just a wee bit, but hopefully it was worth your time. We had some really fun stories here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. And so yes, please do in the comments, or if you watch this later on YouTube, let us know if you have other thoughts about shows that we can do in the future. Monsters, mysteries, myths, all that kind of thing. We are always happy to hear from you. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up down below, like us, drop a comment down there. That's a huge help with our algorithms. And of course, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to get these wonderful weekly explorations of fascinating history of mysteries, monsters, and myths from all over the world. We want to thank you as always, Ron. Always great to chat with you about this stuff.
And hanging out with these guys as well too. You can't beat it.
Absolutely. So, guys, have a wonderful rest of your night. If the full moon is shining, make sure you keep some wolfsbane and some silver handy. And we will see you in 1 week on Monday night, Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. Good night, guys.